So, it's that time of year again, and everyone's favorite home invader is back. No, not the guys from Home Alone. I'm talking about Santa Claus. Most of us have probably already outgrown the jolly old fat guy and don't believe in him anymore. But did you know he actually is real? Or should I say he was real? Yeah, he's been dead for a long time now. Sorry for getting your hopes up, but at least now you can learn about how St. Nicholas of Myra became the man we all know and love today. The story of old St. Nick is one full of gaps and questions. Oh, but how can that be? Everyone knows that history is perfectly documented. Yeah, I wish it was. To tell you the truth, historians aren't even sure if St. Nick of Myra even existed. The first historical record of him is more than 100 years after his death, when a church was built in Myra in his name. And then another 100 years go by, before any mention comes up until Emperor Justinian ordered renovations on his church in Constantinople. Even his first biography wasn't written until about 500 years after his death. But due to several bishops and nobility taking the name Nicholas to honor him a few decades after his death, and the fact that he had a tomb that you could visit, most historians just agree that a historical figure named Nicholas probably existed. So while it's not 100% certain, it is highly likely that he did. Okay, now let me just summarize his life real quick. He was born into a rich family as an only child, and inherited all their money when his parents passed away. He spent this money helping the poor and spreading Christianity. A few trips to Jerusalem and some Christian magic later, he eventually died on December 6th and is honored as a saint. The saint of what exactly? Well, lots of things. Children, merchants, travelers, and the list goes on. Now let's dive into some of the stories of old St. Nick, shall we? The first story involves 3 girls, St. Nick, and bags of gold. Okay, I promise it's not what it sounds like. Essentially, a father of 3 girls was poor and couldn't pay the dowry required to wed them off to someone, so the girls were probably going to be forced into a life of prostitution. Upon hearing this, St. Nick was determined to help his family out, so at night he would go to their house and throw a bag of gold through their window. He repeated this for the next 2 days, and some stories even say that on the 3rd night he dropped it in through the chimney. And so, not only were these 3 girls saved from a life of prostitution, but also we got our first association between gift giving and St. Nick. Now this second story sounds more like a horror movie at first. These 3 kids go into a tavern where the innkeeper has them killed, butchered, and their meat pickled. When St. Nick heard about this, he hurried to the inn, where he not only turned the pickled children back to normal, but he also resurrected them. The stories deviate here. In some, the innkeeper apologizes and his barren wife has a child, and in others he's punished accordingly. Either way, this story gives us our second Christmas association, St. Nick and children. But we're still about 1,000 years away from Santa Claus becoming a thing. So in case you couldn't tell, St. Nick was enormously popular in Eastern Christianity. This can be attributed to the Russian conversion of Christianity, which started with this terrifying woman and her grandson. They pushed for Christianity in Kiev, eventually setting the groundwork for Christianity spreading into Russia, making the cult of Nicholas even more popular. Remember when I said St. Nick is literally the saint of anything? Well, his popularity kept growing, because any group could say that the St. Nicholas was their saint. This was because he could be the saint of anything, from children and sailors all the way to merchants and pawnbrokers. And so, both peasant and nobility accepted St. Nick, and the popularity of his cult kept growing. Though it was restricted to just Eastern Europe, we can thank a group of sailors for committing the heist of the century. Probably. For spreading it everywhere else. So basically, in 1087, a group of merchants from the city of Bari wanted to increase tourism in their city so that they could make more money. Let me just tell you how I think this conversation went exactly. Hey, you know what really attracts tourists? Saints. Well, there's no saints buried in Bari, so what are we gonna do? Remember St. Nicholas? He was pretty cool. Too bad he's buried somewhere in like Turkey. Hey, you wanna go steal him? So putting my incredible acting skills aside, that's exactly what they did. As much as I want to go into this crazy, wacky story, that'll have to be a video for another time. I'm just gonna have to give you the Cliff Notes version of this if I want to get this out by Christmas. So they set sail and arrived at Myra. They tricked the monks into letting them into Nick's tomb, and they proceeded to grave rob him. Okay, before we go any further, I just want to make it clear that the transfer of bones of St. Nick is a heated debate currently, as historians and theologians argue whether the bones were given to the merchants so that the tomb wouldn't fall to the Muslims, or if it really was just straight up Tomb Raider Saint Edition. Either way, the jury's still out. But we at History Lane think it's funnier if they just showed up and stole some bones, so that's what we're gonna go with. And so the merchants returned back to Bari, where the other merchants, the bishop, and the monks all got into an argument about where they should bury the bones. They eventually decided to just build a new church for St. Nick and bury him there. The bones now being located in Bari is what helped introduce and spread St. Nick through Western Europe. Take France for instance. The nuns started to practice gift giving on the eve of St. Nicholas Day, to poor children in honor of the stories of St. Nick. This tradition spread to the rest of Europe, and gift giving on this day became more common. So everything was moving along just fine and dandy, at least until Martin Luther had to ruin it by nailing his 95 Thesis on the church door. And thus began the protest to end all protests, the Protestant Reformation. So this is a whole nother thing, but I mention it because it affects St. Nick, and the fact that it led to an outright denial of iconography. In simpler terms, the worship of saints was frowned upon, causing more and more Protestant countries to be against the idea of St. Nicholas Day. This eventually led to the gift giving being transferred over to Christmas Day, along with the Christ child being the one who gives out the gifts. Literally baby Jesus. Who thought this was a good idea? Well anyway, some countries went along with this rejection of St. Nick, while others didn't. Specifically the Dutch. In Amsterdam, the love of St. Nick, or Sinterklaas, was too great, and none of the reforms during the Protestant Reformation really stuck with them. The Dutch soon brought their love of Sinterklaas to America, in the American Dutch colonies of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and most importantly New York. New York is particularly important here, because of a certain club, the New York Historical Society. The NYHS truly started the transformation of St. Nicholas into Santa Claus. So the story starts with John Pintard, a merchant and philanthropist, who was in charge of the NYHS. He contributed to the tale of Santa by starting the annual St. Nicholas Day dinner in December, where he commissioned a carving of St. Nicholas to be made, dressed in bishop clothing. The next person to contribute to the transformation was Washington Irving, brother-in-law to Pintard, and America's first real popular author. In 1809, he wrote the satire, A History of New York. In the book, he references St. Nick 25 times and emphasizes the importance of him in Dutch culture. In the story about Christmas, Irving reveals the character of St. Nick in a wagon, being pulled by a horse and sending presents down chimneys. Most historians today believe that Irving was lying about the importance of St. Nick in this book, since it was a satire after all. But the idea of St. Nick as imagined by Irving stuck, and would be expanded by one of the most important poems in American culture. "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," written in 1823, was the poem that really established Santa Claus as we imagine him today. In it, the classical features of Santa Claus were given. His sleigh being pulled by 8 reindeers, his bishop robes switched out with fur coats, and most importantly, he delivered presents on Christmas Eve, not St. Nicholas Day. This was a massive development, as it moved St. Nick from being mildly associated with the early Christmas season to now being a full Christmas entity. This poem also transformed St. Nick from a bishop to a jolly old man, akin to more of a folk hero. While the other mentions made minor changes to the St. Nick lore, this poem solidified the change to the modern-day Santa Claus. And the person to credit for this massively popular poem is still a heated debate. Gee, what a shocker. In the end, it boils down to 2 people, Clement Clark Moore or Henry Livingston, each with a strong claim to the authorship. We can't give a definitive answer on which has a stronger claim, so we'll let the professionals come up with a decision on this one. Regardless of who wrote it, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" etched its mark on Christmas history by fully associating St. Nick with Christmas. Alright, we're almost done now, just a little bit more to go. A few key details of Santa Claus were still missing in the poem, mainly his appearance. The poem described him to be more like an elf than a jolly giant. He was described small in stature, and in some illustrations of the poem he wore green. Thomas Nast changed some of these features in his illustrations in the Harper's Weekly in 1881, as he gave Santa a full beard, a jolly face, and a belt around his round belly. He was also the one that added that Santa Claus lived in the North Pole, he had elves as assistants, and that he had a ledger for all the good and bad children. The heart and soul of Santa Claus would be given by Francis Church, a young journalist of the New York Sun, when he answered a young girl's question on whether Santa Claus was real in 1897. He wrote, "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus." He then went on to explain in the editorial on how miserable it would be if Santa wasn't real, as there would be no blind faith in goodness. So even though it wasn't his intention, Francis Church established the Santa Claus spirit as belief in goodness. This influential line was used in many movies, and the response that Church gave to Virginia was reprinted every Christmas in the New York Sun. So finally, the last contributor, and the one who finished it all, was the advertisement artist, Hadan Sundblom. He had worked on the massively influential Santa Claus Coca-Cola ad in 1931. He put the finishing touches on making Santa Claus a full-sized adult, wearing his iconic red coat and cap. Before Sundblom, Santa Claus was not standardized, They would draw him short or tall and wear colors anywhere from red to blue. Sunblom's work for Coca-Cola gives us the modern image of what Santa Claus is. And since it was featured for Coca-Cola, it solidified the popular imagination of Santa Claus in the eyes of the consumer, and therefore American culture. Here's a fun little fact. This advertisement was so persuasive that for a long time, it was believed that Coca-Cola had invented Santa Claus to sell their products. So in the end, the transformation from Saint Nick of Myra into Santa Claus was a long ordeal, one that spanned continents and centuries, one that involved myths, heists, and good old-fashioned consumerism. It was a transformation that made a religious figure into an American folktale made to sell products. Truly the definition of American capitalism. So anyway, whether you're celebrating Christmas for religious reasons or just to get some gifts, hopefully you have a wonderful Christmas and happy holidays to everyone. Hey, if you want to be on Santa's nice list this year, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave some feedback for us down in the comments. See you guys next time.